it is a very important sector, and I think that that has been echoed here today and in other places as well, as it relates to the amount of revenue that it earns the country, over 70% and upwards in most instances a year. So we cannot discount the importance of it, and we also cannot discount the volatility of it, as we heard about the always the changing goalposts all the time, and what the country continually has to do to kind of meet those goalposts so that we at least stay above the water and keep earning that revenue so that we can do some good to our citizens. But what is interesting in this particular debate is that, from what I'm hearing from the Senator Cummings, is that really the country should not have a fear that there will be a fallout in terms of businesses that are domiciled here in this country. What we've heard is that these companies were canvassed, and the government tried to, in their own way, rub shoulders or communicate with these people to get an idea of if they were going in the right direction. And so it seems to me that our presence here today has suggested that there was some general commonality in that we don't have to fear a mass exodus of businesses that are in our shores. So we are comforted by that. But I'll go a different direction than the previous speakers, because, sir, if there's no mass exit, then the government and Barbados is in for some increase in revenue. And I dare say that we should enjoy some revenues over the next couple of months or over next year, depending on when other jurisdictions start to make their changes that we may have to flex or so forth. But from what I'm hearing today, the government is comfortable with its decision to move to 9% and to do the top-up tax, and that we shouldn't fear. So if that is the case, sir, I believe that Barbados, through the government, will have additional revenue sources or additional revenue income. And what it does is that it creates then, sir, the opportunity for the government to do a couple of things. And with more revenue, sir, I think the people of Barbados can appreciate that the government can look to see what they can do as it relates to the cost of living. And I say that from a genuine position, because in 2018, when the government came into office, they put additional taxation on Barbadians. Barbados also experienced a certain level of inflation of the highest levels that we've seen in recent times over the last 6 years. Obviously, global wars, the COVID pandemic, etc. So we are hearing the pressure from the people. So if the government has additional revenue at its feet, the question is, how then do you use some of this revenue, if not all, to the best interest of the country and to the people? I think that is what is missing from this conversation. How can the government, in its comfort, knowing that there will not be a mass exodus, knowing that revenues are moving upwards, albeit that there will be some concessions, there will be some tax credits, etc., we expect that we will have some additional revenue to spread across specific ministries or to spread across individual ministries to give relief to Barbados. And one of those things that Barbados are expecting is a relief in the cost of living. So I think that could be addressed by the government. It is not an unreasonable position. The tax revenue base for the government since 2018, if we compare 2018 to our forecast for this year, we're looking at maybe a 25% increase in tax revenue. So it's a significant amount of revenue from taxes coming a lot from, obviously, VAT, excise tax, etc., which are taxes that consumers pay every day. And we know, sir, that has been driven primarily by inflationary pricing in the market. So I think it is not unreasonable to ask for consideration from the government to look to see where they can ease the pressure, given the fact that they will enjoy some additional revenues as well. And they themselves will have to come up with how they think is the best way to make sure that whatever relief is offered, if any, actually goes to the pockets of our taxpayers, our citizens who are seeing, some of us are seeing it very difficult. So, sir, that is one thing that the government can do with the additional revenue. The second thing, sir, is that there needs to be an improvement in some of the social services that we have. And this is really critical when we have persons looking on and seeing how a country is governed, because you are asked to contribute to the governance of the country by the way of your payment of statutory obligations, by your payment of VAT, by businesses being regulated and paying in that tax, etc. It is a huge burden for not only the companies to carry, as Senator Watson has said, no, the bill as it stands is going to extract money even faster from our businesses. So you're extracting more money at a faster rate, and I think the citizenry is owed the benefit of making sure that is put into the economy, put into the social services net in a useful way. In a useful way, sir. I have been privy to videos of the state of some of our schools. I have been privy to, you can see the steel in the structure. You can see the ceilings coming out of the roof. And it is not to say that these are all situations that have occurred overnight. I would not be silly enough to say that. What I'm saying, sir, is that we need to set aside resources that we can deal with some of these things. And if we have an opportunity where more money is going to be coming into the government, then a portion, if not all of this excess, can be put in a fund to start to deal with some of these issues. We have situations, sir, where persons are not paid in a timely manner. Whether that is because of the bureaucratic nature of the processes, or whether that is lack of cash flow. The point is that I know for sure and for certain that their nurses have not been paid for 4 months. I know for sure, sir, also that the government is borrowing for everything that needs to be done in the country. And I'm saying to you that there has to be at some point in time when the government sits back and decides what is the best way in which I can use the resources that are afforded to me. And if this situation presents the opportunity to put the money into usefulness, to put it into places that are needed, that one, it serves the need, improves infrastructure, and two, it allows us not to have to borrow. That is my simple answer. My simple answer is that I think we have acknowledged that in some form we will get more money as a government, as a country. What we need to be mindful of is that we need to use these resources now in the best way possible for the citizens of Barbados. So the final point I want to make is in relation to the overall focus of tax policy in general. We see the focus on, or refer the focus on corporation tax, maintaining a tax structure that enables us to be alive and to earn in excess of $400 million in revenue. We spoke about, during the budgeting process, about concessions and so forth. But what I think is missing from the conversation is the tax policy on the personal level, on the worker level. And I mentioned it in the previous debate, sir, and I want to repeat it here today, sir, that, no, we're not, hopefully. But no, I want to repeat it here, sir, that while we are looking to improve the economy, while we are looking to drive growth through business facilitation, through business growth, we cannot drive growth without participation from persons, from employees. And so we have to look at ways also to encourage those persons to be productive. Encourage those persons to want to come to work, to want to give their all, and to want to meet the company halfway. And then together, they can meet the government or the economy as a whole so that there's a participatory effect and that everybody's taking along on the journey. And I bring into the conversation then, sir, the ability for the government to consider what drives productivity in Barbados, which is the people. And how do we treat the people? How do we treat a person that is exemplary in his work and performs above expectation and is rewarded by his employer? And that employer then gives him a financial compensation. We tax it. It is taxed almost, I think almost 30% of it goes. And that is not his ordinary income. That is not his 40-hour-a-week income. That is not something that he signed on to. It is not in his contract. It is something that he has earned above and beyond. And it has been at the discretion of his employer who values him. That is being done taxed at almost 30%. But the profits of a company is being taxed at 9%. So there has to be some balance here as relates to how we look at compensation above and beyond a salary or a weekly wage. You have situations where from time to time, especially around the holiday seasons, businesses pour into their staff. They give a weekly wage, they give a month's salary, they give 6 weeks' salary, and that is subject to almost 30% of tax as well. But that in itself is a reward. That in itself is driving the person to say, I want to come work next year. I want to come work every day. I want to give my all. I want to work overtime when I'm asked to. That is what it's saying. But if you have these measures that persons stoops, suck their teeth at a compensatory, a financial benefit that they know that at the end of the day really doesn't make any sense. And you hear that. You hear that, especially when it comes to overtime, when it comes to ask somebody to stay back to work 2 or 3 hours. It doesn't benefit me financially, so I'm not staying back. And they're looking at the money that they have to take, they put in their pocket. So all I'm saying, sir, is that this is a conversation that stretches beyond just the corporate tax, the minimum global tax rate, but how do we treat to the persons, the stakeholders, which in this case are the employees of the company that will see it through its growth. And today, I am asking for consideration for this government to look at its tax policy on a more holistic, take a more holistic approach, and where we have allowances for research and development, have incentives to play a role if businesses are engaged in specific activities. What is wrong with an employee having a taxable allowance for a family of 5? For mortgage interest. So, sir, these are important things, and I don't think that we, as a society or as a government, as regulators, should exclude the people that are driving the businesses that are going into these global businesses that we call them now, and working and giving their all, sometimes working 12 hours, 15 hours a day, so that Barbados can earn revenue, but so themselves can sustain their livelihood. So, sir, all I'm saying is that this debate provided the opportunity for me to just state the case, one, for the fact that we have more resources as a government and that we can do some critical things with it. We can look at a cost of living ease for the citizens, and we can look also at how we utilize these additional monies to redevelop Barbados in terms of correct critical infrastructure in our school plants, especially, sir, in our hospitals, in our polyclinics, without having to borrow every cent, without having to go now and borrow another $20 million, another $30 million to get it done. And I also ask for consideration today, sir, let us look at the persons that are involved in business. Not only the business itself, but the persons that are involved in business, that drive the business, that ensure that these companies want to be domiciled here as well. So, sir, with those few words, I thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Senator Walters. Her Honour, Senator Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I must concede that I had not initially intended to speak on this, but there are a couple of matters that were raised during the course of the debate that I want to address, and in particular, to look at this whole issue of the level of global regulation, not just of tax, but of organizations which impact governance at the national level, and the extent to which small states, such as our own, are asked to cede sovereignty, to use language that was used today, to cede sovereignty to these international organizations. Before I get into the crux of the remarks that I want to make, I just want to make a couple observations in relation to the broad discussion that we heard today. It is easy to make arguments such as, if there is going to be no flight of companies or capital, give people a little taxes. Cut this and cut that. This feeds in an inflation real high. This feeds into a narrative that the government is not doing everything that it possibly can to reduce prices and give tax breaks. Only a week ago, a friend, for the first time, getting full tax breaks on his property, paid $50 in land tax, and said to me, "Kiss Ademir for me." I paid $1,200 the year before. Now that makes a significant difference, and I could point to other things in which government policy has directly impacted in a positive way by reducing costs, high expenditures, and hardships that families would otherwise have faced if not for the intervention of government policy. The Honourable Senator Cummins, in her introduction of the legislation, made the point of the child who had urgent surgeries and a 2-week stay in hospital. I link that to the point that is not being made by those on the other side, which is that there is an extremely high level of pricing globally and high inflation. And Barbados, as a price taker, a small island developing state, which is not a major manufacturer, which is constrained by population size, 8.6. Inflation globally is 8.8%, higher than the Barbados level of inflation, which is several points below that. So the point is that because we are price takers, the point is that because we cannot create economies of scale, the point is that because we have a small population, so our tax base is small to begin with. And the point is that because our business landscape is made up of micro businesses, not even medium or large size businesses, then the tax revenues generated by them are really very small. So it is not, I don't want to say it is not a sensible argument, but it is an argument that begs people to look at it and wonder what drives the thinking of the person who made the argument to say that inflation in Barbados is high. What is the global and Caribbean context in which Barbados exists and in which our tax structures and our inflation rate is driven? And if you look at government policy, if you look at our inflation rate versus the rest of the Caribbean and versus the global rate, if you look at the positive policy interventions, if you look at the tax reliefs that this population is being given, then you will see that a government that doesn't have a lot of flexibility, a government that doesn't have a lot of fiscal space, a government that is coming out of a lost decade, a government that is coming out of a COVID-constricted cash situation, is really doing everything it can to shield the national population and to cushion the blows coming from the international situation. So because people experience difficulty when they go to the supermarket, because things are expensive, and the natural inclination is to look for someone to blame, the opposition is capitalizing on blame the government, while never putting out any suggestions of options that would make a difference. But we cannot blame the government where there is a global atmosphere of high prices, of high inflation, of high costs, and capital constraints for which this administration has no responsibility. Nor can you blame the government for the very adverse conditions which they took over and are still fighting to reverse because of the international landscape and challenges like COVID, which severely impacted the performance of the government or the delivery of services, because you simply had no revenues to deal with. So that's my first point. Having said that, I want to appeal to BRA based on two experiences shared by various persons with small companies. One of them is being charged penalties and interest for non-payment of certain taxes. An option available to citizens and to businesses is to drop your check in a box from which it is retrieved, documented, or put in ledger, e-ledgers these days, I would imagine, or I would hope, put in the ledgers, and then record, your payment is formally recorded. When checks are put in the box, boxes are not necessarily cleared on the same day. The checks are then given to the officer who has to record them. So when checks come in, if I have a pile, the check that comes in on that day goes to the bottom of my pile. Depending on my processing rate, it could well take me a week or two to get through with all of the checks in my pile, given my other functions and responsibilities. When I record the receipt of the payment, I record it on the date that I have have noted the check in the ledger. And I'm saying ledger, but clearly the systems are computerized. A person who pays or paid a day or two before the deadline for payment will have paid within deadline, as they should. But because the record is formally made 2 weeks later, it appears as if they have made a late payment when in fact they have not. And they therefore incur fees, penalties, interest, and additional charges, which really and truly is not fair to them. And for small and micro businesses, which are operating as it is on very thin margins, really can make a difference because these numbers add up over the course of time. So I would wish to appeal to the management, whom we have present with us today, to consider implementing a system which does not prejudice the persons paying who do pay within the deadline, but because of the recording system, really are recorded as having paid late. The second thing is that there are fees and penalties which you pay if you have a dormant company, if you don't report, file your taxes regularly, etc. There are high costs that are incurred. I would wish for us to review this, because very often these companies, many companies that are dormant, are really small family businesses. Granny used to operate a small shop. The lawyer tells Granny she should incorporate, that is better for her tax-wise. Nobody else in the family is involved in the accounting process. Granny sees about that herself. Like all good Bajans, she holds her money tight. You could go and pick up something. You can go and dispatch. You can serve. You can do various things, but Granny is holding on to her money. When Granny suffers a stroke, nobody knows that Granny did not file the year before, or that year that she suffered the stroke, she didn't file. You may or may not continue operating the business. But you are incurring on the books, on government's books, fees, charges, and penalties for what government regards as a valid and operating business, when in fact, it may take 5 years before Granny's estate, when she passes, is resolved. In the interim, you have incurred charges, in theory, which really you should not have, because you were not validly operating, or you were not operating a business at all. So that we need to look at practical systems in the context of what we know are the cultural and social realities, so that people really do not suffer prejudice by the existence of rules meant to catch those who are deliberately trying to escape payment of what is due to the government, when in fact some micro and small businesses often don't know the rules, do not intend to be in breach, and it is really family circumstances, or the way in which their businesses operate, or the informality with which a lot of small businesses operate, that causes them to suffer these challenges. So those are the 3 points that I want to start with. And then, sir, I move to what I indicated at the start that I would want to address. And you will appreciate, sir, that coming from an international relations perspective, that this is a matter of concern to me. The global institutions which govern how we engage with one another, whether it is in international relations generally and the multilateral system, whether it is the Bretton Woods institutions, or whether it has to do with the OECD or the UN itself, were all established out of the root of empire and reflect the colonial mindset that is intended to preserve a dominant class or a dominant set of states, and to keep subjugated another set of countries. Moreover, when a lot of these structures were established, states that now exist, Barbados, the whole Caribbean, several countries in Africa, across the Pacific, these were not nation states. These were not sovereign states. These were colonies run from the empire, run and operated as the colonizers wanted, however they deemed most beneficial to them. And if you look at the evolution of foreign exchange earnings and revenue generation in small states and developing countries that were formerly jewels in the empires, you will see that they started largely either as extractive economies with mining and so on, or agrarian economies, and that over time, as economic emphasis has evolved, a lot of them went into service economies, and several of them went in then to financial services. And what has happened is that the OECD, which was established in 1960, sir, before I was born, before many of the people in here were born, represents some 40 countries only. The UN has 163, or is it 183, countries as member states. The OECD, which governs global tax rules, formulates, implements, operates global tax rules, represents 40 countries only, but determines what everybody in the world does. And it is again easy to say that we are incorporating rules that militate against sovereignty. But the reality is that when you have a dominant player or governor in the market, your options are either to play the game to protect your citizens or stand by the wayside and say, not me, I ain't playing. You wanna don't play fair, and be blacklisted or graylisted so that you suffer reputational damage at the international level, that nobody does business with you for fear that their own reputation is damaged, and that you suffer all of the consequences of appearing to be an uncooperative tax jurisdiction. The government of Barbados, intent on protecting its sovereignty and its citizenry, has taken the decision that while we do not necessarily like the way in which these global players, or some may say global bullies, operate, that we have no choice but to get on the playing field and make sure that we kick and maneuver the ball and get it into the goalpost, even if the goalpost is shifting, if we want to maintain our foreign exchange earnings, and if we want to maintain a good global reputation, and if we want our citizens and our sovereign state to be seen as a serious international player in world affairs. So yes, there may be instances in which we have to consider the extent to which we will follow the rules, but we do so only and always in protection of the Barbadian and in protection of every single Barbadian. The EU and the US earn 50% of global revenues. Yet, when you look at how the OECD operates, those countries which control massive wealth, large populations, large asset bases, large capital bases, massive wealth, those countries which conceal international criminals or the revenues or transit of the monies of international criminals are not largely the ones appearing on the black list and the gray list. When you turn to the list, you hear Vanuatu, a microstate with a mini population, Palau, Dominica in the Caribbean is one of the 30 least populated countries in the world, population of 79,000 people. These countries that are threatened daily by the rules of the OECD operate clean jurisdictions in the majority, operate with due diligence, were not impacted when the global contagion of the international financial collapse took place because of the stringent rules for doing business there. But yet, all the time, they are the ones on the front line of defense, of attack. For what? Earning money honestly, because they have become efficient and good at it, and are not no-tax jurisdictions, but are low-tax jurisdictions competing legitimately in the international financial space and being punished for it. It is for this reason, Mr. President, sir, that there has been now for perhaps about a year, and I want to share with you a quotation that I found interesting, sir. I have sent the source to the clerk so that it can be made available, sir, as a document of the House. The OECD Secretary General, deputy secretaries and heads of the directorates are non-elected administrators and policymakers who live in Paris tax-free, except for the Americans, travel first class, live first class, and whose every expense is paid for by the member states with taxes or money borrowed. These are the guys who tell everyone else to pay their fair share of taxes and share in the making sacrifices for the greater good of all. Now, you had to laugh or smile at least at the language of the writer in this article. And it raises the question of how do we democratize the institutions which govern the world? How do we make them more transparent? How do we make them more accountable? How do we make them more equitable? How do we make them more just? And how do we ensure that they employ and deploy rules of natural justice, where they do not say, well, we think you have committed a wrong and we are putting you on a list. And if you don't like it, work hard and get yourself off, but for the time being, you are condemned. And that is why, over the course of the last maybe 15, 20 years or so, maybe not so long, there has been an increasing push for there to be a tax institution, a global tax institution, operated within the context of the United Nations, so that it would be more open, more accessible, more democratic, and run by a larger number of member states who each have a vote. Now, make no mistake, even if this were to come into being, the reality is that those who dominate the present institutions are equally going to try to assert their presence and influence and dominance within any new institution, so that the fight will not be over. The fight will just take a different form. And we will have to continue to take the decisions necessary to defend and protect, to guard and to guide our populations and our policy. So that increasingly, and I'm trying to get the exact, the UN Second Committee led by the African states pushed in 2023 with support and with now over 200 unions and organizations joining and taking up the cry for the establishment and on the promotion of inclusive and effective international tax cooperation, and that a body should be established within the context of the UN. It is Resolution AC2/77/L18. Where does the Caribbean stand on this? Are we trying to change the structures that we don't own, but to which we are compelled to answer in order to effect decisions for the development and the dignity of the nation and our nationals? This has now become a major global issue. Certainly it may not be on the lips of the person on the bus on the ZR heading to Haynesville, but it will benefit the person on the ZR heading to Haynesville if we are able to reform international institutions. And this is part of what the Bridgetown Initiative is about. It is about calling us to look at the existing structures within the multilateral development banks, to look at the fact that the fiscal space within which small states and certain developing countries operate is so limited that we are in effect strangled financially and economically, and that our citizens do not have the same opportunities at development. And therefore we are calling and requiring a change which leads to greater democracy and larger access for the citizens of the world who now are called to join the family photo, but are not called to the table when the meal is being served. And we therefore, as a people, and there's some issues on which we should not fracture at the political level, because the fight is not at the political level. The fight has to be at the global level. And so it is easy to go to the easy narratives, the narratives that will sell, the narratives that people will run with, while not treating to what the deeper underlying issues of international governance are, and what it is we as the leaders of small states are fighting every time we step offshore and go into the international forum. So that you have to balance what you say here, what you do there, how you do it, what legislation you enact, which you don't, the pace at which you do it, who you invite in to do business, with whom you do business, while those who are really the international terrorists and the international terrorizers go scot-free and earn more and more money. The face of colonialism has changed, but not its intent. And therefore, we have to be cognizant that as leaders, we continue to fight for sovereignty. And the question for us as a people is, having assumed republic status, when in the international arena there are still those who are able to crack the whip, those who are able to determine our fortunes, those who are able to determine the livelihood of citizens by the decisions that they make. How do we break out? How do we so transform the global financial, the global economic, the global governance structures and systems within international institutions, that we create a larger space for our citizens, that we create genuine opportunity for our economies to grow and grow exponentially, and that we maintain not just the semblance, but the real presence of states that operate ethically at the national and global level. Had that been the conversation today, sir, I would not have spoken. I would not have had to speak. But because this relevant Conversation was not put on the table. We were stuck with the easy narratives. We were stuck with the inaccurate narratives. We were stuck with the trite political arguments. Because we did not invite the chamber and the country to face what is the reality of leadership in the context of a small island state, leadership in the context of a microeconomy, leadership in the context of a global structure where you cannot make the rules. You learn to play within them even when the goalpost shifts. Where we have to learn now to move to a larger forum, that within the context of the United Nations itself, and fight there. Mr. President, I had said that I had not intended to speak, and it was true. And I had said that I would not be long. That was my present intention, sir. But I felt that as somebody who works in the field of international relations, and given the fact that, I have served as Barbados's ambassador to the United Nations, and that I understand that these are not issues that are as simple or as simplistic as we were being led to believe. I really thought it essential to put on the record the broader arguments, the broader fight, the deeper, more potent, more powerful realities, so that the record today on this debate would be more accurate and more reflective of the challenges that we face in leadership on this and other issues. And I thank you, Mr. President, for your indulgence. I must support this bill because of the good work that I know the government is attempting to do on behalf of all the people of Barbados.
Thank you very much, Her Honour Senator Thompson. If there are no more speakers, I'll invite Senator Cummings to close.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I, as always, wish to thank all honorable members who have spoken and who have contributed to this debate. I know that for the most part, this is not one of those, forgive me for using perhaps a little unparliamentary, being a little unparliamentary, Mr. President, in my language. This is not one of those sexy topics that, will excite imaginations. A lot of times we ain't talking necessarily in this instance about garbage and water and those kinds of things. These are issues that people tend to tune out because they think, boy, that's a little too highbrow for me. I can't really deal with all of that. And so attempting to keep it as simple and to connect it to how a government governs both internationally in its international relationships, as was just done by Her Honor Senator Thompson, and how our international relationships intersect with our domestic activity as a legislature, as well as how our fiscal responsibilities to how we treat to the management of money and revenue, as was raised by Senator Walters in terms of if government has an increased tax stake, how will those monies be spent? Will those monies be allocated to development programming? Those are the kinds of things that perhaps, Mr. President, I want to focus on in my response as I attempt to go through some of the issues that were raised by the colleagues. Let me begin, Mr. President, by saying first and foremost that this government does not, did not, has not, nor will I ever expect it to have perfunctory conversations with people and call it consultations. This government, even before we came to office, before we were responsible for governing a country, we undertook, Mr. President, to have a rubbing shoulders campaign. We walked the length and the breadth of this country as BLP on the road. That is the philosophy and the practice of governance, even by a government that was not yet in government. And so, Mr. President, when we came to office, one of my colleagues likes to call it, when we came to service in 2018, we did not stop doing that. Mr. President, we have continued to consult and engage with people day in and day out. We have continued with Parish Speaks, where the average Barbadian is invited to come and to engage with the mechanics of governance and government on a monthly basis, so we can share with people what the issues are. How are some of these highbrow issues that we talk about connected to the issues that people are feeling on the ground? We ain't just come. We've been doing this for years, Mr. President. And so all the ones who would wish to now come and begin to lecture us on what the people are saying, Mr. President, who do not have the track record of this party or this government, and would wish to lecture us now on what people are saying, we'll and come again. We'll and come again. Okay, I'll take that. My colleagues have corrected me. We've been doing this for long, though. We didn't just start. And on these matters, Mr. President, specifically on these bills, that philosophy that has guided us on the ground from before we were in government in 2018 continues to guide us on every matter each and every time. And this matter, these two bills, were no different. Mr. President, there has been a comment raised, or there have been queries raised about the depth of our presentation, of our consultations. Mr. President, I am certain that those who are members of sector associations are in touch with their representatives and with their leaders, and that when the state, through those leaders that they elect or appoint by whatever means of selection to represent them, and those agencies come together in a consultative forum with the government, that they are in turn going back and reporting to their membership. And it is my clear understanding, Mr. President, and I was present in more than one forum, where many of the members of the various sector associations and the leadership of the sector associations met with the agencies responsible for implementing these reforms. This is not legislation that was imported, Mr. President. This is not legislation that was given to us only by advisors, Mr. President. And I think that I was fairly clear in my opening that consultations were wide and they were deep. And that anything that is before us, first, the policy that informs the legislation, and then the legislation that codifies the policy, that they were the subject of collaboration. Mr. President, I must tell you that I am incredibly impressed by the team at the Barbados Revenue Authority, and I say this with no ambiguity in my words. The Revenue Commissioner, if I call Louisa at whatever hour, I am going to get a response, without doubt. That has been my experience. Her officers are the same. I have traveled with her officers, and I can say to you that like most technical agencies, they do have capacity challenges. I can say to you that they do not have all the manpower that they need. I can say to you that as we introduce, as was done with KIPO, with all of the economic substance regulations that were introduced as a result of global changes, that there's always going to be a need for an upgrading in capacity at all times. This is never a static thing. It is a dynamic and a constantly evolving reality of governance. And so, Mr. President, it is on that basis that I can attest firsthand to the fact that for the broad reform and the capacity development of the Barbados Revenue Authority, that is very much underway. They have integrated the international relations element to which Her Honor Senator Thompson spoke into their operations with the creation of a new unit on international policy internal to the Barbados Revenue Authority. I'm not even quite sure that's what the title is, but they now have a dedicated person dealing with what's happening internationally. And they have been at the vanguard of developing new technology platforms to make sure that what may have started out as TAMIS evolves into something that ultimately is a single portal. And just maybe 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, if so long, we had a joint meeting with our digital coordinator from the Ministry of Energy and Business with responsibility for transforming the challenges that we acknowledge are still ongoing with the corporate digital registry to ensure that all businesses in the country are in a position to have a single digital interface when coming to engage with the government. And the expectation, and I'll leave it to the BRA to announce in their own time, is that that will come sooner rather than later. And I leave it to them to advise on the when. But what I can tell you is that it is already in development. Specifically now, on small businesses, that portal is very much in development. My team and I from the Small Business Unit and Small Business Development Unit and the broader Ministry of Business have met jointly with the BRA to demo their new portal to see what is going to be happening there. And one of the things that we have deemed important, and the Prime Minister has spoken about this at great length, certainly for MIST, that new technology platforms have to be able to speak to each other. They have to be able to interact with each other. And so any new platform coming into the government must interface with an evolving platform that must be updated. And so the small business platform of the BRA is expected to be in effect by the end of this month. It didn't come as a result of anyone who just come calling for it today. It has been in development for an extended period of time, and it is in the final stages of preparation for being launched. I want also to say, Mr. President, that a few weeks ago, maybe before the budget, not a few weeks ago, early in March, we also had a follow-on engagement with the small business representative bodies. Before that, the Barbados Revenue Authority, along with the various tax advisors, also had a dedicated meeting with the small business sector. We ain't just come about here, Mr. President. We've been doing this for long. So the Barbados Revenue Authority took the time to go and engage with the sector to get their feedback, to be able to understand what the users of these portals were experiencing, what they wanted to be able to see, and we actually have a full submission from the Small Business Association on what they would have wanted to see in the recommendations, and that is before this government, because we consult wide and deep. That is the reality of governance, Mr. President, and so we have committed to a philosophy of engaging with people. I give the assurance, though, that we have not taken anything in full without robust engagement on what we want to do. Mr. President, in 2018, when we came to this honorable chamber to pass the BERT program, the first one, we came under all kind of robust opposition at the time. It was called the Earlier BERT program. It was called all kinds of things, Mr. President, because the notion at the time was that it was a foreign imposed structure that had nothing to do with Barbados. And it did not matter, it has not mattered, Mr. President, how many times we have said the facts. And the facts are, this was a homegrown program for Barbados. It benefited from international inputs, and BERT 2 is another homegrown program where we work with our international partners and our local partners to develop something that is fit for purpose for Barbados. But Mr. President, let us not pretend. Let us not pretend. I am proud to be a Barbadian. I am proud to be from Barbados. I am proud every time I go somewhere and somebody tells me, your Prime Minister is amazing. I am proud every time I go somewhere, Mr. President, and somebody stops me and tells me they want to take a photo because they want to send it to somebody because they are so pleased to be engaging with somebody from Barbados because we are seen as a leader. Mr. President, there are doors that have been opened and continue to be opened because of the leadership demonstrated by Barbados. But let us be clear about what that leadership is also about. It is not just about doing the work substantively. It is not just about developing the capacity and understanding the issues before you and representing them effectively on behalf of your people. It is also about understanding, Mr. President, that this 166 square mile country with less than 280,000 people will always import inflation because, as the Honorable Deputy President said, we do not produce the majority of what we consume. And I would never be complicit in attempting to fool Barbadians into thinking otherwise. I would never be complicit, Mr. President, certainly from this side of the table, in saying to Barbadians that we operate in a system where we make tax rules coming only from Barbados. International engagements are a natural part of life for the biggest of countries in the world, but they are even more important for the smallest. They're even more important for the smallest. And the ability to engage and to sit at the table where rules are being made and to benefit from international partners who are also sitting at that table, those tables, cannot be sufficiently understated. And I would not wish to pretend that Barbados lives in this magical, mythical bubble somewhere in the stratosphere where we don't interact with anybody else and we don't have any international partnerships, international relationships, we don't import anything. That's not a real thing. Not in any universe, not even for the biggest in the world, but it is not for the smallest. And it is for that reason why Barbados insists on making sure that we have a seat at every table. And I want to be clear, the OECD relationship with countries like Barbados has evolved significantly beyond where it started. I remember being a young Foreign Service officer in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the 1990s, where we were still having an aggressive conversation with the OECD. We were in battle in perpetuity, Mr. President. And the difference between what I experienced as a young Foreign Service officer at the time in the 1990s, where the OECD functions separately from everyone else, and what I see now as the minister who has been engaging with the OECD alongside the other agencies, is vastly different. The OECD has not blacklisted us. EU countries may have blacklisted us on the basis of different methodologies, but Barbados has seen a relationship with the OECD through the Global Forum, through the Inclusive Forum, through the FHTP, where all of our reports have been on the basis of engagement. All of our engagement has been on the basis of active participation. Mr. President, when the Barbados assessments are being done, we are working hand in glove with those partners in the OECD, in the Global Forum, in the Forum on Harmful Tax Practices, in the Inclusive Framework. In the Inclusive Framework, as I said earlier, we sit at the table. And so, Mr. President, the recommendations usually coming from the OECD would be reflective of what we have worked on, and the recommendations would then go to what we call the EU Code of Conduct Group. The EU Code of Conduct Group then, in turn, uses the technical assessments done by the various OECD bodies, and they, in turn, make recommendations on what should happen in a given jurisdiction. And so, on the one hand, we can say that through active international engagement and through active international partnerships, we have been engaging with the OECD and its organs, and at the same time, as a country that has always favored multilateralism, we are equally confident with the evolution of this conversation beyond the OECD into the United Nations, where everyone has a seat at the voting table among 191 members. Whether it is at a multilateral level at the UN, or it is in the Paris Club that you call the OECD, I believe, this government believes, that Barbados has an obligation to participate in the international system. Barbados has always been a nation governed by laws. Tax rules have always been determined and negotiated globally. This is no different now, Mr. President. And so I want us to put that into context. The other thing that has been raised here, Mr. President, and I always like the terms predictable and transparent systems of governance. Because in my own background as a trade specialist for international trade, we want to be able to have transparency and predictability. Companies want to be able to know, this is the tariff rate that I am going to be having, these are the standards to which I must adhere, these are the market entry or these are the market barriers that are going to be presented to me, and these are the structures that I'm going to have to engage in on a domestic level, and these on my competitors once I enter a foreign market. Transparency and predictability are critical. So it is easy to rubbish Barbados being a first mover, but we cannot rubbish the fact that companies need the very transparency and predictability that being a first mover brings. That transparency and predictability gives companies the certainty that they need to make decisions about where they are going to keep or move their domicile. And Barbados has done its best with all the advice in the world and with the full participation of all affected sectors to make the best decision to influence that outcome, Mr. President. And because of it, the companies, including those in the smaller category, have very much welcomed Barbados's attempt to give them that certainty and to be able to say to them, for the upcoming tax year, we want to be able to plan, and they have made that very clear. Mr. President, I also want to make the point that, opposition politics is an interesting thing, and I know that the Barbados Labour Party has practiced it in a previous incarnation. It may not come in a hurry at the rate that the other side is going, but we'll see. But at the same time, Mr. President, we know what it is to oppose constructively. Mr. President, a significant component of global business right now is something called ESG. It's easy to rubbish the SDGs. It's easy to rubbish the conversations on things like resilience.
Senator Cummins, I hate to interrupt your flow, but on behalf of the general public, please explain the acronyms.
I will.
And thank you kindly.
So, in the global business space, the Prime Minister of Barbados, in her advocacy on climate, in her advocacy on the climate crisis, and the need for countries to make changes to the way in which they consume energy and, 1.5 to stay alive and those kinds of things. We understand those things. But those things have a connection to global business, Mr. President. There are companies in the world, some of them right here in Barbados, that have entire sections or lines of their business dedicated to environmental and social governance. There is an entire line of business that is in place, Mr. President, that Barbados, as part of its investment attraction strategy, as part of its global business strategy, has determined in its reports from as far back as 2022 in the preservation report and in all of the international business strategy papers since then, that Barbados has prioritized the development of the ESG line of business to have companies domicile that here in Barbados or to bring their lines of business here to Barbados, because Barbados wants to ensure that we are not just talking about climate, we're not just talking about vulnerability, we're not just talking about resilience, but we are also practicing it in every possible respect, including, Mr. President, in our lines of business, and including, Mr. President, in the companies that we attract to Barbados. Let me give you an example. There are some countries in the world, if you remember, back in the day, we used to have a drive down, we used to call it BET Hill. If you're from a certain generation, we know what BET Hill is. And we know what BET Hill is because when you drive down the hill from Polytechnic and from the CDB, right there in front of you, that imposing building that is now an offshore university, it used to be Intel, right? It used to be Intel. And at the time, you had entities that would come and they would set up for light manufacturing or assembly plants to come, or small technology companies, and they would come, and then you had the offshore transcription, medical transcription at one point. Companies moved over many years to do different lines of business, and in the Pacific region, for example, where you have seen the assembly the spatial allocation of assembly plants across the Pacific region in order to tap in to the business that is car manufacturing in places like Japan, and now the evolving industries that are coming in the manufacturing sector in China. ESG, Mr. President, and I've given the explanation for the acronym earlier, this is a line of business, Mr. President, that is a downstream and an upstream connection to resilience, and to the small sustainable development goals, and to our conversations on vulnerability. And so there is an absolute connection, and there is an absolute reason why the honorable member in the other place would have spoken about these things, because these create business opportunities for Barbados to connect its philosophy, who we are, with what we do, and our management of our nation. Mr. President, I'm advised on the next point by the Barbados Revenue Authority on the point that was raised earlier about funds where they are applied and persons not having them applied to their accounts, that there were some challenges with a number of taxpayers submitting payments, but not the information associated with those payments. And as a consequence, they needed to reconcile who the payments correlated to and what then they needed to be applied to. And the Honorable Deputy President is nodding that she's one of them. And so they have created a dedicated team to be able to resolve that. And I'm sure that they will put necessary communications around it so that it wouldn't happen again, where taxpayers are submitting a payment, but they ain't telling you this is for which account. And so they now have only 1% of those unapplied accounts outstanding, and they will continue to work through the process of getting that down to zero. If the Honorable Deputy President is still among them, I'm sure that it will be resolved shortly. Now, Mr. President, the other element that I want to raise is on KIPO. I have never, and I will not now, attempt to say anything other than the fact that I acknowledge that KIPO has been a challenge, without a doubt. KIPO has gone through several incarnations, and I've spoken about KIPO on more than one occasion in acknowledgement. I can only say to you that the changes that we are aggressively and actively working through now are, we hope, the final incarnation of many generations of tinkering with KIPO. But just like the BRA, and just like the legislation that we have here today, Mr. President, this legislation, Mr. President, has implications, as was said earlier, and rightfully so, for the capacity of the BRA. Could you imagine that just like for Companies Act, there are 17 pieces of legislation administered by KIPO? Could you imagine, Mr. President, legislation, piece of legislation after piece of legislation being amended, new obligations being assumed, and then assigned to the BRA in some instances, and in the case of KIPO, that is also the case, but without the requisite additional resources being provided. We are making sure that that generational challenge that has plagued institutions is addressed in the case of KIPO through the creation of a new entity. And so finally, Mr. President, I want to, in commending this bill to the Honorable Chamber, I want to close by saying this. Sometimes the government takes every action, at all times, I should say, within its control, and those words are important, within its control to take decisions. On the issue of persons who have arrears as a result of not filing annual returns, that is a KIPO matter again. But Mr. President, even though as a government we would have wanted to address the issue of waivers, we still had to consider that at the time that this was being discussed, this relationship between international relationships and domestic policy cannot be escaped. And at the time, Mr. President, you would recall very well being in the driver's seat very much of relationships with other entities abroad, FATF and others included. And there were peer reviews ongoing, which included how Barbados not just did assess which companies on our register were active, which constituted economic substance, which companies needed to be struck off from the register because they were inactive, which companies were considered high risk, Mr. President, and which companies had not filed, and in those instances where they had not filed, where penalties or sanctions could be levied. If you were to waive the penalties and the sanctions in those moments during the process of peer reviews, there would have been implications that you would not have wanted for the country in terms of grey and blacklisting. And so a government has to take all of those considerations into account when making decisions. And so I want to give the assurance that we as a government are committed to our people. We are committed to good governance. We're committed to national development and national transformation. And we're also committed to our international relationships, which very much help to fuel a lot of what we do on 166 square miles to punch above our weight, while still acknowledging that our weight requires us to always be sitting at the table and helping to frame the conversation. And with these few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do not leave the chair and the Senate dissolves itself into a committee of the whole for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honorable the Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Madam Deputy President, may we take the bill in parts?
Permission granted.
Part 1, clauses 1 through 4.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 1, clauses 1 through 4 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 1, clauses 1 through 4 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 2, clauses 5 to 8.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 2, clauses 5 through 8 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 2, clauses 5 through 8 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 3, clauses 9 to 22.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 3, clauses 9 through 22 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 3, clauses 9 through 22 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 4, clauses 23 to 28.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 4, clauses 23 through 28 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 4, clauses 23 through 28 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 5, clauses 29 to 34.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 5, clauses 29 through 34 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 5, clauses 29 through 34 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 6, clauses 35 to 38.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 6, clauses 35 through 38 do now stand part.
The question is that clause 6, beg your pardon, part 6, clauses 35 to 38 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 7, clauses 39 to 43.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 7, clauses 39 through 43 do not stand part.
The question is that part 7, clauses 39 through 43 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 8, clauses 44, 53.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 8, clauses 44 through 53 do not stand part.
The question is that part 8, clauses 44 through 53 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 9, clauses 54 to 56.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 9, clauses 54 through 56 do not stand part.
The question is that part 9, clauses 54 through 56 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 10, clauses 57 to 64.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 10, clauses 57 through 64 do not stand part.
The question is that part 10, clauses 57 through 64 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Part 11, clauses 65 to 69.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 11, clauses 65 through 69 do not stand part.
The question is that part 11, clauses 65 through 69 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
The first schedule.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that the first schedule be the first schedule to the bill.
The question is that the first schedule be now the first schedule to the bill. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Second schedule.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill.
The question is that the second schedule be now the second schedule to the bill. All honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Chairman has reported the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that we do not read this bill a third time.
The question is that the bill be read a third time. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The ayes have it. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Corporation Top-Up Tax Act 2024.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Corporation Top-Up Tax Act 2024. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited.
Order number 5, sir. Leader of the Senate to move the second reading of the Income Tax Amendment Bill 2024.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill not be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the Senate resolves itself into committee for consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honorable the Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Those honorable senators in favor please say aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Madam Chair, Clause 1. Clause 1. Just, yes, you only know the amendment.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that this short title, that Clause 1, be amended as to read as follows. That it reads the Income Tax Amendment and Validation Act 2024. Insertion of the word validation.
The question is that the title be amended, the Income Tax Amendment and Validation Act 2024, with the amendment being the insertion of the word validation. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Thoughts?
Permission to do so granted.
Clauses 2 to 9.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clauses 2 through 9 stand part.
The question is that clauses 2 through 9 stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Clauses 10 to 15.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clauses 10 through 15 do now stand part.
The question is that clauses 10 through 15 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported the passing of one bill in committee.
Mr. President, I beg,
Bill amendment.
Mr. President, I beg to move this bill be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. The ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Income Tax Amendment and Validation Act 2024.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Income Tax Amendment and Validation Act 2024. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. The ayes have it. This act is now passed and so cited. Please note that the technical amendments having been made as requested, the usual formal notification will be transmitted to the Honorable the House of Assembly, inviting its concurrence with those small amendments.
We revert to reports from Select Committee, sir.
Reports from Select Committee. Senator Nichols.
Mr. President, the Senate would recall that on the 14th of February, the matter of the consideration of the Cybercrime Bill 2024 and the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Amendment Bill 2024 were read for the first time in the Senate, and that it was considered by the Senate that we should resolve ourselves with the House of Assembly to consider those aforementioned bills in a joint select committee of the Governance and Policy Matters Committee of the Parliament. We were to have a period of 3 months to consider these bills in joint select committee. But you would appreciate that with the formal appointment of a leader of the opposition and the taking the place in the Senate of 2 new opposition senators, the work of that joint select committee could not begin in earnest. And therefore, we began long after the period that we would have wanted to begin. I stand before you today to request that the Senate consider and approve a request for an extension of time up until Friday, the 14th of June for the Joint Select Committee on Governance and Policy Matters to complete its work in relation to the aforementioned Cybercrime Bill and the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Bill. We have had 4 meetings of that standing committee, and we have been receiving oral submissions from members of the public, and the committee members have been asking questions of those members of the public who have appeared before it. And we've also received a number of written submissions for which the committee now has to consider, so that in the circumstances where our time period is set to run out, I am requesting that the Senate now approve an extension of the committee to complete its work up until the 14th of June, 2024.
Mr. President, I second the request, the motion.
Thank you very much, Senators Nichols and Walters. The question is that the Committee on Governance and Policy Matters, this is a joint select committee, be given an extension of time to report until Friday, June the 14th, in its 2024, in its consideration of matters related to the cybercrime bill and the mutual assistance in criminal matters bills. Those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. The resolution is passed, and the time is therefore extended to June 14th, 2024. Under this head of report of select committees, I have the report of the Committee of Selection to the Honorable the Senate. The Committee of Selection of the first session of the Parliament of 2022-2027 met on Wednesday, 15th May 2024. That's today. Present were myself, His Honor the Most Honorable R.R. Farley, Senator the Honorable L.R. Cummins, Senator K.J. Boyce, Senator Dr. C.K.M. Haynes, Senator T.D. Watson. In attendance were the two Deputy Clerks of Parliament, Nigel Jones and Beverly Gibbons. The committee met, this meeting was occasioned, of course, by the change in composition of the Senate with the appointment of opposition senators and the reduction of the independent senators from 9 to the usual 7, the 2 opposition senators present. The committee therefore met to consider nominations for membership and proper constitution of the committees of the Senate, making note, of course, that the Committee of Selection and the Joint Committee of the Joint Select Committee standing on governance and policy matters had already been sorted out. The committee proposed that in relation to the Standing Orders Committee, the membership of Senator Reverend Canon Dr. J.A. Rogers be withdrawn in favor of Senator Watson. The committee proposed that in relation to the House Committee, the membership of Senator Manilow be withdrawn in favor of Senator Walters. The committee proposed that in relation to the Committee of Privileges, the membership of Senator Reverend Canon Dr. Rogers be withdrawn in favor of Senator Watson. In relation to the Regulations Committee, the membership of the Honorable Little Nurse be withdrawn in favor of Senator Walters. In relation to the Library Committee, the membership of Senator Dr. Crystal Haynes and Senator Kevin Boyce be withdrawn in favor of Senator Rand Walters and Senator Tricia Watson. In relation to the Committee of Public Accounts, the membership of Senator John King be withdrawn in favor of the Honorable Chad Blackman. Further, the membership of Senator Honorable Little Nurse and Senator Reverend Charles Morris be withdrawn in favor of Senator Ryan Walters and Senator Tricia Watson. The committee proposed in relation to the Committee on Economic and Productive Sectors, the membership of Senator Crystal Drakes be withdrawn in favor of Senator Tricia Watson. The committee proposed Senator Ryan Walters serve on the Committee on Social Sector and the Environment, and the committee proposed as well that Senator the Most Honorable Jerome Walker on the Management Commission of Parliament be withdrawn in favor of Senator Tricia Watson. Those proposals were unanimously agreed by the committee. In summary, therefore, the committee makes the following nominations for appointment to the committees, which I will once again cite, that these are the nominations for the approval of the Honorable Senate. Standing Orders Committee, Senator Tricia Watson. House Committee, Senator Ryan Walters. Committee of Privileges, Senator Tricia Watson. Regulations Committee, Senator Just a second. I think there's a typo here. Deputy Clerk Gibbons. Beverly. I think you very well have a typo here. Just a second. Regulations Committee. But just as I put in the recommendations, which will draw to the attention that the facts are, I was really speaking of a Senator T.D. Walters. Senator R.O. Walters in relation to Regulations Committee. So she just have to. Right. Okay. The Regulations Committee, Senator Walters. Library Committee, relation for the appointment of Senator Walters and Senator Watson. Committee of Public Accounts, appointment of Senator the Honorable Chad Blackman, Senator Walters, and Senator Watson. Committee on Economic and Productive Sectors, Senator Watson. Committee on Social Sector and the Environment, Senator Walters. The Management Committee of Commission of Parliament, Senator Watson. The committee hereby submit its report accordingly. Signed by me as chairman, the day 15th of May, 2024. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to propose the adoption of the report of the Committee on Selection.
The question is that the Honorable Senate do now adopt the report of the Committee of Selection, and the adoption of this report triggers the appointment of those senators so named to the committee, to the committees listed. Will those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Those senators therefore stand appointed to those committees. Congratulations, honorable senators, and I thank you for agreeing to serve as indicated.
Mr. President, there being no further business for the remaining of today's sitting, I beg to move the adjournment of this sitting of the Honorable Senate. Sine die.
The question is that this sitting be now adjourned sine die. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This sitting of the Honorable Senate is therefore adjourned sine die.